Hello, and welcome to my Walking with a Camera. I'm in Old Fort Erie. This is a recreation of a fort that was built in 1804, which replaced an earlier fort which had been built right down by the water at the Niagara River and Lake Erie in 1764. The reason I'm here today is there's a historic reenactment that's taking place and recreates the Siege of Fort Erie, which took place in late 1814. This fort had been captured by the Americans in the summer of 1814 and was one of their first targets. They held the fort until December of 1814 when they blew it up. Now, I did an earlier video about that when I came here and talked about Fort Erie and St. Paul's Church. St. Paul's Church was built in 1821 from the stone that was recovered here, and the fort had never been replaced. The current structure was built in the 1930s as a government make works project, and now it's a historic site, and it's rather cool. There's still evidence around the fort of the occupation when the Americans here, because one of the things they did was they had expanded the defenses, and on this side of the fort there's the remnants of an earthwork that ran from the fort all the way to what was known as Snake Hill, where there was a battery of guns commanded by a Major Towson. And that's what I'm doing here today. But it's not just to record the event that I'm here for. I'm also doing photography. And I'm shooting a lot of the fort in black and white. See, the fort is constructed out of what is known as Onondaga flintstone. And it's a very cool material. It's gray, and I can show you some. If you look down there, this bastion, that is what it looks like. And that's what I'm doing here today. Photographing the event, also doing some photography. There's also a lot of tourists around because this event, which they put on every year, the first weekend in August, is extremely popular, not only amongst the tourists, but amongst the reenactors. So there's two main camps here, one British, one American. So it should be a good day. We're going to wander around, take some photographs. This fort has a really interesting sort of dual history. One, it was built prior to the turn of the 18th, 19th century, and it was occupied by the British until 1814 when it was captured. The Americans blew it up in December when they retreated back across the Niagara River. It was a government make works project during the 1930s, during the Depression. But there's a piece of history here from the Crimea War in Russia, 1856. I'll show you that right now. Let's go for a walk. Hey there. The cenotaph is one of the most poignant reminders of the Siege of Fort Erie. The British, when they assaulted the fort, Did it at night, and unfortunately the assaults failed. There were 3 columns. One column went through this bastion here. Another assaulted the area between the lake and the bastion, and another one assaulted Snake Hill. All 3 assaults failed with extremely heavy casualties. And the assault that went into this bastion, at one point in the battle, the bastion exploded, and that pretty well ended the assaults and sealed Lieutenant General Drummond's decision to abandon the siege. This cenotaph was found when surveying was done, that it was a large grave pit the Americans had dug to place the remains of British soldiers who had been killed during that assault, and the cenotaph was constructed to commemorate them. So here lies the remains of over 1,000 British troops that were killed during the siege from August to September 1814. Kind of poignant. War is never clean, war is never polite. It's dirty, it's bloody and messy, and this siege was a hard siege for the British. The weather was against them. The Americans were in force, and unfortunately for the British, they were never very patient when it came to siege work. Poignant reminder. In 1863, the United States is going through its Civil War, which started in 1861. What a lot of people don't know is there was a lot of tension between the United States and Britain. Because of the Trent affair, and to give you a bit of background, the Royal Mail steamer Trent was carrying 2 Confederate diplomats when it was stopped by an American warship. And that warship at gunpoint removed the Confederates, violating British neutrality. Britain threatened war. The United States was fully prepared to invade what becomes Canada in 1867. And the tensions were running pretty high. Thankfully, in negotiations between Prince Albert and Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, that war was avoided. However, Great Britain reinforced its garrisons in what becomes Canada. One of the things they moved over here was artillery. This particular gun, however, is not British. It's Russian. During the Crimea War, with the fall of Sevastopol, Britain captured a large quantity of Russian military equipment, which they shipped back to Britain as war booty. After the Trent affair, Britain reinforced its garrisons in North America, and one of the things they moved here was a lot of the captured artillery. These Russian guns can be found all over Ontario. There's one here at Fort Niagara. There's another one there's one here at Fort Erie. There's another one at HMCS Star, which is the Reserve Naval Squadron, in Hamilton. There are 2 outside the Ontario legislature. There's one in Brantford, which has an interesting history of its own. And there's one in Cambridge. Now, there were others moved here. Now, after the American Civil War, these guns were emplaced in various batteries around Quebec and what becomes the province of Ontario. But eventually, They were decommissioned, and they became gate guardians. And this Russian gun ends up at the reconstructed Fort Erie, overlooking the mouth or the entrance to the Niagara River from Lake Erie, which is just over there. And this is the American camp for the reenactment. Let's go have a look. So this is the American camp, and this is the American Army. And they are forming up to receive orders, do drill, figure out what they're going to be doing today. I spent 30 years carrying a musket doing that. Glad I don't carry a musket anymore. The British camp will be doing pretty much the same this time. They'll be going through doing safety checks of the weapons and making sure everybody is okay. A lot of rain here this morning. Very cool. They will, these are the American forces that'll be here for the weekend. Coming into small British encampment here. This will be fencible troops and British Indian Department troops, while main force regular troops are on the other side. This is a good day. Hopefully, won't be any more rain. Let's go have a look at the British camp. A slight rise in the ground that runs from the fort to Snake Hill, which is that direction. This is the remains of the expanded American fortifications that they built just prior to the siege. And this area behind it is where the main American camp was. There was somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 8,000 American troops here. Not as many British, but their siege lines ran outside the walls. The siege was ultimately a failure for the British, and it was extremely wet with the winter coming on. The British evacuated the siege lines and went back to their fortifications and camps or Chippawa Creek, which is just north of the fort, and settled down for the winter. Apart from some inconclusive skirmishing, everything from Fort Erie to Chippawa Creek basically became no man's land. And as no man's land, there was not much going on. There was the Battle of Cook's Mills, which the Americans claim is a victory. The British, however, never intended to hold ground. Cook's Mills was being used as storage for barrels of flour, which the British wanted to recover from the mill. They succeeded and withdrew back to the Chippewa defense lines. The Americans were left in possession of the battlefield, but so what? The British had completed their mission, which was to capture or to reacquire barrels of flour. And then things settled down. December of 1814, the Americans blew up Fort Erie and retreated back across the Niagara River to modern-day Buffalo. morning parade for British forces, and this is the British camp.
General, salute!
And they've just marched on their colors. This gives them an opportunity to do a safety check, review troops, find out how everything is theirs. Yeah. Good day.
Shoulder! Arms! Order! Arms! Stand at ease!
So that is the British and American camps at Fort Erie, recreating the Siege of Fort Erie, which took place late summer, early fall of 1814. All of these people are historic reenactors, whether they're from the United States, Canada, wherever. This is a hobby that they enjoy, recreating the history of the time period, getting all hot and sweaty in 2 layers of wool. There are reenactments all over Ontario and the United States doing the War of 1812, which is this one, or the American Revolutionary War. I even have friends of mine who dress up in armor of the 14th century and go wailing away at one another for a weekend. But it's more than just the history that these people are trying to recreate. It is also the friendships that they have amongst this community, the shared interest of the history and the past and bringing it to life. I've met some of my best friends doing this hobby. I met 2 wives. My children were involved in it for a long time. All throughout the area where you live, there are interesting historic sites. Some of them have events like this, Fort Erie, the first weekend in August. Others, they don't, but they're interesting to visit. You should check them out. Have a look around. Explore your own bit of the world and find out what its past was. Just remember, keep walking with a camera. Till next time, cheers.